So this video, in the freezing cold, hence the woolly hat, is all about suspension. Now, I wanted to talk about suspension a little bit because it's on my mind at the moment, because if you've been following the channel for a while, you'll know that I recently bought this bike. So I've been playing around with the suspension and I've still yet to go out and ride it properly and fine-tune the suspension. But if you bought a bike recently, or the next time you buy a bike, or even if you've got a bike and you had it for a while and you've never touched the suspension, then you really should do a few basic things at the start. And the first thing is to figure out what kind of suspension and what kind of adjustment you have in your bike, or what adjusters it has available. And then setting the right amount of sag for your rider weight and style is really, really important. Now I'll talk about what those things mean in a second, but the reason it's important is twofold. One, because it will determine how the bike behaves, how comfortable the bike is, how confident, inspiring the bike is, and actually how safe the bike is. If the suspension is behaving wildly, it's going to be very unstable and you increase the chances of an accident. So let's get to talk about the sag. What does that actually mean? When you sit on the bike will sag, and that is what we're talking about. And controlling how much, or adjusting how much that bike sags, is really important, because then it will determine how the bike behaves when you're out riding. Now there is there's much more to it than that. So sag, getting those numbers right isn't the only thing, but it's your starting point for any bike that you get. So let's talk a little bit about sag. Let's go to the bike and I can show you what I'm talking about. Okay, starting with the front of the bike, inside this suspension fork will be a spring. When you sit on the bike, that spring compresses slightly, and that is what we talk about when we mean sag. The spring is compressing under your weight. That's nice and simple, right? Now you can adjust how much that spring compresses by adding or removing preload. Preload means how much the suspension spring is preloaded with tension. And most bikes, not all bikes, but many bikes will have adjustable preload. How do we do that? Well, on my bike, but every bike is different, please don't take this as a how-to. If you've never done this before, don't go and start messing around with it after this video, because there's much more to it and I might do more videos. But ultimately, these two funny shaped things, those are my preload adjusters. Some bikes you can only adjust preload on one side and the other side has different adjustment, but I don't want to confuse things. But ultimately, many bikes will have a preload adjuster on both sides. Now yours might not look like this, because these star-shaped things are aftermarket preload adjusters. This allows me to adjust the preload by hand. Some bikes will have a hex nut, so you'll need a socket in order to make that adjustment. And as I said, other bikes might be even different to that. Some bikes even have electronic suspension and you do it through the dashboard, or it automatically adjusts. But ultimately, most bikes will have some sort of manual adjustment. Now, when I said earlier about preload, you preload the spring with some tension. Adding preload, i.e. on this bike, turning these clockwise, adding tension will reduce sag. In other words, if I add loads of tension, when I get on the bike, it's not going to move very much. If I release tension by turning these counterclockwise, if I reduce preload, then the spring is, for want of a better word, softer. It's not actually softer, but it's just got less tension in it. But that means that when the spring has got less tension in it, I get on the bike, it's going to sag a lot more, because there's more available movement. I hope I'm making sense, folks. So in short, more preload means more tension on the spring, which means less sag when you get on the bike. Less preload means less tension on the spring, which means more sag when you get on the bike. So if you need to increase sag, you need to remove preload. If you need to reduce sag, then you need to add preload. Now the rear is exactly the same, so let's take a look at the rear. When I say exactly the same, what I mean is the principle is exactly the same. So there's the spring, we can see the spring on the rear. This will have a certain amount of preload, which means I get on the bike, that will sag slightly. If I want to increase the amount it sags, I will reduce preload. I will take tension out of the spring, and therefore I get on the bike, the spring will seem softer and it will sag more. If I want to reduce sag, then I add more tension by compressing the spring a bit more, and it will sag less. The adjustments on the rear shock here, you can see these two metal rings just above the yellow spring. The top ring is a locking ring, so I would loosen off that locking ring, and then the bottom ring is the adjusting ring. On this bike, some bikes are different. On this bike, as I'm looking down on top of the spring, clockwise on that lower spring, on the lower ring, will increase preload, therefore reduce sag. And if I turn it anti-clockwise, it will reduce preload and therefore increase sag. Nice and simple, hopefully. But ultimately, that is front and rear preload, which affects the amount of front and rear sag. Now remember, this is not a how-to video, and if you don't know what you're doing, don't go out there and start messing around and putting massive different adjustment in your front and rear sag, because you might ruin the ride of the bike completely and make it even more unsafe. If anybody wants to know how to set the right amount of sag for your rider weight, i.e. what numbers to achieve, how many millimeters of sag to achieve, and exactly how to do that, let me know in the comments, and I might make another video on that. But the main point of this video, folks, hopefully now you'll understand what I mean by sag and preload. There is lots more to suspension. This is just talking about those two things, sag and preload, how much tension we put in the spring before we even start riding. Hopefully you understand those things now, and check out what adjustments your bike has, and don't go adjusting it unless you know what you're doing. Let me know if you have any questions, folks, but hopefully that helps.
Do ba do ba do ba do ba do ba do ba do ba.